5 years it's been. 260 weeks since the day I stepped foot into that office, 1,826 days since the day that changed my life. I remember stepping into that waiting room, feeling my stomach wrestling back and forth and my head starting to spin. I stared at the floor, hoping to shrink down to a microscopic size. I was so embarrassed. My whole ideology and depiction of myself was shattered. Before I stepped into that waiting room, I thought I was perfect and I was doing everything right. It wasn't that I was wrong, but there was more to the story. More happening inside my head that I could no longer control. I heard my name called and my heart sank. I slowly got up and walked towards the door. I sat down in this strangely small office with a woman named Nicole. She began to tell me about herself and asked me to do the same. I said my name was Samantha, but she could call me Sammy. And then she began to ask me more questions about my life. And she began to scribble on a piece of paper. And she asked me, well, how does that make you feel? I didn't know how to answer. Sad, I guess. I was confused and lost. Nicole was not confused and lost. 5 years later, I finally understand what Nicole saw in me. 5 years of walking in and out of that office, I finally understand why my parents and family were so worried about me. 5 years later, I've learned there's a diagnosis to describe what I experience. It constantly beats me down whenever I do anything wrong. It tells me I'm a waste of space if I'm not being productive. It makes me second guess myself. It sends me into spirals of worry and doubt. There are not enough words to describe what this it does to me. But everyone experiences this it. But sometimes the it can be uncontrollable to the point where someone needs help. I needed help 5 years ago. The it is more formally known as anxiety, and my name for it, Mr. Negative, and society's depiction of it, an absolute nightmare. This is me when my story began. In about 3rd grade, I remember taking the infamous times table multiplication test. I remember finishing up the last few problems and the sound of the timer going off. And I remember the thoughts that immediately flooded my mind. What happens if I do badly? Will I be okay? This was only the beginning of these scary and intrusive thoughts. She'll outgrow it, teacher said to my mom, but I didn't. It wasn't just a coincidence that I was the last person to finish every test. Just breathe, you'll be fine, teachers told me, but it felt like I couldn't, and I continued to get lost in my own thoughts and lose concentration. 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. The diagnosis of this disorder sent me into a spiral. What did this mean about me, I thought? I thought that it meant that I was imperfect and not good enough. For as long as I can remember, I was obsessed with this idea of perfectionism. I felt the need to be perfect in every single aspect of my life. It sounds kind of crazy and silly when you say it out loud, but it truly was a struggle for me. It wasn't up until this last year that I became aware of how hard I was pushing myself. No wonder I woke up every day feeling exhausted. During this time, I took the time to realize that I was pushing myself a lot, and I learned to appreciate myself for who I really was, even with my anxiety and my flaws. In our crazy and ever-changing world, mental health awareness is so prominent and important. Just to share some statistics, about 1 in 5 adults and 1 in 6 children suffer from a mental illness, yet only 46.2% of these adults receive treatment. From a statistics perspective, mental illnesses are extremely common. But when I was diagnosed 5 years ago, I felt extremely alone and insecure. But why? Why was I feeling this way? Why was everyone so scared of this disruption of neurotransmission? Why are we so scared of a difference in brain chemistry? Even Isaac Newton suffered from a mental illness, and he is considered a genius. Why discriminate those who suffer from mental illnesses? Just like an injury, we can't control if we have one or not. Society's depiction of mental illnesses is why I felt so alone, insecure, and not good enough throughout the early stages of my diagnosis. We need to change this. We need to come together and destigmatize mental health, and here's how we could do this. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, there are 5 ways to break the mental health stigma that resonate with me and help me the most. Number 1, talk openly about mental health. As you could imagine, it took a lot for me to get up on this stage today and talk about my own insecurities and struggles. But in order to open up the conversation about mental health, I knew I had to do so. Yes, I have generalized anxiety disorder, one of the many anxiety disorders that exist today. And yes, I see a psychologist and a psychiatrist. Admitting to these realities about myself made me more confident and encouraged me to talk about mental health more. Number 2, educate yourselves and others. Of course, education in school is important, but learning about these illnesses is too. The more we can all talk about them, the more people will be open to sharing their stories. So, what is generalized anxiety disorder? Generalized anxiety disorder is substantial, excessive, and ongoing worry that affects day-to-day life. About 6.8 million adults suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, which is about 3.1% of the US population. Generalized anxiety disorder affects someone like it just stresses them out every day, and stress is a normal human attribute that we need in order to survive. But when someone with generalized anxiety disorder is stressing about every little thing, that's when it's anxiety. Number 3, be conscious of language. Remind people that their language matters, and something that they could say may hurt someone or be demeaning to someone who suffers from mental illness. For example, I hear this one a lot. I had a panic attack earlier today, and this person does not suffer from anxiety and does not suffer from serious panic attacks. This could be considered something extremely demeaning to someone who suffers from serious panic attacks. Number 4, choose empowerment over shame. I fight the stigma by getting up on this stage today and talking about my own struggles. Like I stated before, I see a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and I'm not ashamed. As you can imagine, they make me into the person standing before you who is confident and calm enough to talk to you about these issues. Number 5, don't self-harbor or self-stigma. This one is most important and was the hardest one for me to learn. Like I said before, I'm a perfectionist, and for a long time, I didn't love who I was. I was extremely insecure of myself and embarrassed of who I was. I really thought that people could tell that I was different, but throughout that time in COVID, I learned to understand that I'm unique and I'm okay even with my anxiety. If there is one thing you take from my talk today, let it be this. For the 1 in 5 adults suffering from a mental health disorder, the 6.8 suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and the little girl who was so embarrassed of herself because of the thoughts she could not control, be kinder, more understanding, and educate yourselves. If we're really going to break the mental health stigma, it goes farther than me sharing my story. Share yours too. And if you don't suffer from a mental illness, then listen. And if you know someone that needs help, get them help. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready to break the mental health stigma and reboot our thinking as a society. Are you? Let's do this together. Thank you.